It started the way these things always do. Not with a conversation, not with a knock on the door, but with a letter. A plain white envelope slipped into my mailbox like a quiet threat. No return address. No warmth. Just an official-looking document with bold words at the top. Notice of violation. It detailed everything I had supposedly done wrong. My mailbox was non-compliant because it didn't match the others on the block. My lawn had grown half an inch past regulation length. My porch light, apparently, was too bright for community standards. There was a picture attached, taken from a low angle across the street. I didn't even know someone had been watching at first. I thought it was a mistake. Surely this was a misunderstanding, maybe an automated form sent out by accident. I shrugged it off. But then came the second letter. Then the third. Then came the fines, $500 a day, every day. No discussion. No warning. Just mounting penalties and cold, legal phrasing meant to silence any resistance. Every morning, I checked the mail with a pit in my stomach. They weren't just fining me. They were burying me alive. One envelope at a time. What made it worse was how deliberate it all felt. Like they were making an example out of me. The HOA board members started driving past my house slowly, pausing just long enough to be noticed. Clipboards in hand, phones pointed discreetly toward my property. The violations became more absurd as the weeks went on. A flower pot placed too close to the driveway. A garden gnome deemed non-standard. Even the color of my curtains, which apparently were too expressive for the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. I began to feel like I was living in a prison of perfectly trimmed lawns and hushed surveillance. It wasn't about the rules. It was about control. Power. The HOA had built its own little empire, complete with bylaws and penalties, and I had somehow stepped out of line. Not on purpose, not defiantly, at first, but it didn't matter. I was now the target. And when the system picks a target, it doesn't stop. It squeezes. It tests to see how much you can take before you either pay up or move out. They don't care which. They just want compliance. And they wanted it from me. Fast my neighbors started noticing. Some pitted me. Others kept their distance, afraid to be associated with someone who had fallen into the HOA's crosshairs. I became the whispered about house. People crossed the street to avoid passing by too close. I caught one woman taking photos through her car window. It was humiliating. But even more than that, it was infuriating. Ipaid malasia duas. I kept my property clean. I wasn't hurting anyone. But none of that mattered. Because the moment you stand out, even slightly, you become a threat to the illusion of order they work so hard to maintain. I thought about giving in. Honestly, I did. It would have been easier to just replace the mailbox, trim the lawn every other day, paint the porch to match their preferred shade of beige. That's what they expect you to do. To fold. To disappear into the rows of identical homes and never question why. But I couldn't. Not because of pride, because of principle. Because if I gave in, I'd be telling them they could do this to anyone. That no one was allowed to be different. That power, once misused, should be tolerated because it's inconvenient to resist. The fines kept coming. The total crossed 10,000. Then 15. The number stared back at me from the paper like a threat. And yet, the more they pushed, the more I pushed back. I stopped ignoring the letters. I started documenting everything. I made calls. I started reading. Every bylaw, every section, every subsection. I built a file as thick as a novel. I didn't know what I was looking for at first. I just knew I had to look, because somewhere in that mountain of paperwork and contradictions, there had to be something they missed. Something that gave me even the smallest crack to push through, and as I read, the story changed. The fear that had followed me every day began to turn into something else. Not hope, not yet, but something close. A realization that maybe the rules they held over me like a weapon weren't as bulletproof as they thought. There's a difference between being fined and being humiliated. Fines are numbers on a page, a calculation. But humiliation is personal. It's slow, deliberate, and designed to make you feel small. That's what the HOA perfected. Humiliation disguised as order. They didn't just want me to comply. They wanted me to be sorry for ever stepping out of line. And the way they went about it made that painfully clear. It started with the notices, but it didn't stop there. I began to notice their cars more often, crawling past my house with the same dull, expressionless faces behind the wheel. No one waved. No one smiled. Just slow, robotic glances and the occasional camera click. I never saw who actually took the photos they included with the violation letters. One morning, I opened an envelope and saw a picture taken from my backyard fence. My stomach dropped. How had they even gotten that angle? Were they in someone else's yard? On my property? It was invasive. It felt less like enforcement and more like stalking. Then came the tape. They stopped sending violations by mail. Now, they taped them directly to my front door. Bright neon paper, so no one walking by could miss it. They weren't just notifying me, they were broadcasting it. I pulled one off one morning and noticed it had been applied at an angle purposefully crooked, like someone wanted it to look sloppy and aggressive. Neighbors began to look at me differently. Conversations in the cul-de-sac would pause when I walked out to check my mail. People pretended not to see me, or worse, smiled in that tight-lipped, pitying way that made me feel like I was being eulogized in real time. One neighbor, a quiet woman 2 doors down, caught me bringing in groceries and asked in a hushed tone if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She nodded, said she'd received notices in the past, too. Just not as many, not as often. I asked what she did about it. She looked over both shoulders and whispered that she just paid them. It wasn't worth the trouble, she said. The board always wins. Then she smiled again, a little broken, and walked back inside. The worst part wasn't the fines. It wasn't the photos, or the tape, or even the gossip. It was the silence. The way no one stood up. The way everyone watched, but said nothing. Because they'd all been warned. And if they defended me, they might be next. That's how the HOA keeps its grip. Not through enforcement, but through fear. Through isolation. Through the careful dismantling of someone's confidence. One violation at a time, I started to second-guess everything I did. I hesitated before planting flowers. I wondered if my car was parked at the correct angle. I triple-checked my trash bins on pickup days. The HOA handbook became a manual of paranoia. Every page, another way to mess up. Every line, a potential trap. And I could feel it changing me. I stopped inviting friends over. I stopped sitting on my porch. I kept my blinds closed all the time. Not because I had anything to hide, but because I didn't want to feel like I was on display, and still, the violations came. They fined me for a garden flag that was half an inch too long. For wind chimes that made unapproved noise. For having 2 bikes in my driveway, even though my kids rode them every evening. It was absurd, but the absurdity was the point. They wanted me to feel overwhelmed, to drown in their paperwork, to waste my time, my peace, my sanity trying to meet standards that kept shifting just far enough out of reach. One day, I saw the HOA president himself standing across the street, talking to another board member. They weren't even pretending to be subtle anymore. He pointed toward my house, laughing at something the other man said. They looked like 2 men admiring a project, nearly complete, proud of the damage done. I stood there behind the window and realized this wasn't about enforcement. It was entertainment. A little game of power and obedience, where they played judge, jury, and executioner. And I was the show, but the humiliation wasn't just theirs to deliver. It only worked if I accepted it. And as much as they wanted me to shrink, to vanish into the beige conformity they worshipped, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't, because somewhere in their smirking confidence, I sensed something they didn't want anyone to know, that their power only existed if no one questioned it. If no one read the fine print, if no one looked too closely at the rule book they use like scripture, there comes a point when you stop being afraid. Not because the threat goes away, but because you felt it so many times, it loses its power. That's what happened to me. After weeks of warnings, of $500 a day fines, of glares from board members and whispers from neighbors, I woke up one morning and something had changed. I didn't feel panic anymore. I didn't feel helpless. I felt tired, yes, but underneath that, something new had begun to form. A quiet refusal. A line that, once drawn, wouldn't be erased. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the latest violation notice in my hand, the words blurring into one another like they always did, non-compliant, immediate action, legal consequences, a language meant to intimidate, not communicate. And I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to ask before. What if I didn't fold? What if I didn't apologize? What if I didn't play their game the way they expected? I could have paid. I could have painted the shutters the approved shade of desert sand, replaced the mailbox with one that looked like everyone else's, removed the wind chimes, rolled my trash cans back with military precision. That's what they wanted. Submission, not cooperation. Obedience, not community. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just being fined for minor issues. I was being punished for not blending in, for not becoming another silent, beige unit on their little grid of perfection, so I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight them with anger. That's what they expected, an outburst, something they could use against me in one of their meetings or write up in their minutes. I was going to fight them with facts, with patience, with precision. I was going to learn their rules better than they did. I started collecting everything, every notice, every photograph, every memo they ever sent me. I organized them by date, by subject, by tone. I looked for patterns. I compared how my violations differed from my neighbors. I drove the neighborhood slowly, snapping photos of homes that broke the same rules I was being fined for, only they hadn't received any notices. That told me something. This wasn't about fairness. It was about picking targets. It was about showing the rest of the community what happens when you don't follow orders fast enough, but just gathering evidence wasn't enough. I needed to understand their foundation. So I requested a full copy of the HOA's governing documents, bylaws, CC and RS, architectural guidelines, even a meeting minutes from the last 5 years. Hundreds of pages, each one a window into how they operated. At first it was overwhelming, legal language wrapped in legal language, but the more I read, the more I noticed things that didn't add up. Vague definitions, contradictions, rules that changed depending on who was being targeted, and that's when I realized something crucial. They didn't expect anyone to actually read this stuff. They counted on the average homeowner being too busy, too intimidated, or too worn down to challenge them. Their authority wasn't built on logic or fairness. It was built on silence. I remember the moment it clicked. I was sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by papers, and I saw 2 rules in conflict. One saying that decorative items were allowed in front yards with board approval, and another that allowed automatic approval for items under a certain height, with no mention of needing to notify the board. The flower pot I was fined for, it was within the allowed height. According to their own rules, I didn't need permission. They fined me anyway, and that was just one example. I started finding more. Instances where the rules contradicted each other, where procedures weren't followed, where approvals were granted to some and not others without explanation. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This system wasn't as airtight as they made it seem. It was stitched together with arrogance and assumptions, never expecting anyone to pull at the seams, but I wasn't just pulling. I was unraveling. For every threat they sent me, I found a sentence they ignored. For every fine they issued, I found a rule they bent. And every discovery made me more determined, not just to stop the fines, but to understand exactly how this organization had turned into a weapon used against the very people it was supposed to serve. I didn't find it right away. At first, the documents felt like a maze. Pages of dry legal jargon, repetitive phrasing, and policies that seemed intentionally vague. But I kept going. I highlighted. I annotated. I cross-referenced notes like I was preparing for trial. And somewhere between the 3rd and 4th reread of their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, I noticed a line I hadn't paid attention to before. A simple sentence buried at the bottom of a section about architectural changes. At first glance, it looked like just another clause, something easy to skip over. But something about the wording felled off. The clause mentioned that any homeowner who submitted a request for property changes and did not receive a response within 30 days would be granted automatic approval by default. That alone wouldn't have been strange. Many HOAs include timelines like that. But what caught my attention was how this clause clashed with another rule in the handbook, one that stated certain changes required explicit written approval from the board prior to any modifications. The 2 rules couldn't both be true. Either silence meant approval, or silence meant denial. It couldn't be both, so I dug deeper. I looked at the timestamps of my own requests, the few I had submitted before I knew what I was dealing with. A mailbox design, a lighting fixture, a new paint color for my fence. In each case, I had sent the proper documentation. In each case, I never received a reply. And each time, the HOA had fined me for making changes without written approval. But if their own documents granted automatic approval after 30 days of silence, then I hadn't violated anything. In fact, they had violated their own rules by issuing fines at all. I felt my pulse quicken as I cross-checked the dates. One by one, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The mailbox change had been submitted 47 days before the fine. The lighting fixture? 62 days. The paint color? 51. All of them well beyond the 30-day window. No responses. No denials. No extensions. Just silence followed by punishment. They had ignored their own process. And I had the proof in black and white. That was the loophole. The flaw in their fortress. Not a clever trick or a technicality I could twist in my favor, but a legitimate contradiction in their governing documents. A failure process. A legal crack wide enough to drive a moving truck through. And what made it worse for them was that this clause had been in place for years, which meant I wasn't the only one they had fined unjustly. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a systemic failure, one that had likely cost other homeowners thousands of dollars in bogus penalties. I printed everything. Every form I submitted. Every fine I received. Every page of the handbook that supported my claim. I organized it all into a binder, tabbed and color-coded and labeled with dates. Then I consulted a friend of mine who had a background in real estate law. He reviewed everything twice. When he looked up from the last page, he said exactly what I needed to hear. I was right. Legally, I had them cornered. Not just for wrongful fines, but for breaching their own contractual obligations to the homeowners. I remember the feeling that washed over me. Not joy, not even relief. It was clarity. For the first time since the nightmare began, I had solid ground beneath me. I knew the game now, and more importantly, I knew how to beat it. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to protest on the street or launch in an angry rant at meetings. I was going to walk in calmly, confidently, and put their words in front of them. Their rules, their signatures, their silence. Because when people build systems designed to intimidate others, they rarely expect anyone to challenge them with logic. They don't prepare for resistance that's patient, measured, and well-documented. They don't prepare for someone who plays by their rules, but better. They're too used to fear, too used to people folding under pressure, assuming the HOA always wins simply because they say they do what I had was more than a loophole. It was the truth. Their oversight, their arrogance, their laziness, all of it laid bare in the one place they thought no one would ever look closely enough to notice. The night before the meeting, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was nervous, but because I kept going over everything one more time. I had all the evidence, every fine, every request, every ignored timeline, every contradiction in their governing documents. I had rehearsed what I would say, not as a speech, but as a series of facts laid out so clearly that even they couldn't twist them. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about standing in front of the people who had tried to make me feel powerless and showing them that I never was. The meeting was held in the community center just 2 blocks from my house. I arrived early. The room smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. Rows of plastic chairs faced a folding table where the HOA board sat in their usual spots. Clipboards out, pens ready, expressions blank. A few homeowners sat quietly in the back, flipping through papers or scrolling on their phones. No one looked at me when I walked in. No one had to. They knew why I was there when my name was called. I stood up and walked to the front. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I opened my binder, turned it toward them, and began to speak. I laid out the timeline of every modification request I had submitted. Mailbox, light fixture, paint, and planters. Each one backed by a dated copy of the email or letter I had sent. Then I showed the dates the fines were issued. In every case, more than 30 days had passed without any written response from board. Then I turned to page 73 of their own CC and RS and read the clause aloud. The room was quiet. Even the board members were still. I asked them plainly, why had I been fined for changes that were automatically approved under their own policy? Why had I been charged thousands of dollars in penalties when the rules clearly granted me the right to proceed after their failure to respond? I watched as they flipped through their own copies of the documents, eyes scanning frantically for a rebuttal, for an exception they could throw in my face. But there was none. The rule was clear. It had been there for years. They had simply ignored it. Or worse, pretended it didn't exist. Then I went further. I presented examples of other homeowners whose similar requests had been ignored, who had been fined for flower pots, fence paint, porch lights, all changes that fell under the same clause. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The point wasn't to turn neighbor against neighbor. It was to show a pattern, a consistent abuse of power wrapped in the language of authority. They weren't just wrong about me. They had been wrong about many. One of the board members, the treasurer, I think, tried to interrupt, suggesting there must have been confusion, perhaps a miscommunication, maybe a backlog in requests. I calmly pointed out that nowhere in the clause did it allow for exceptions based on internal delays. The rule didn't say 30 business days or 30 days if convenient. It said 30 days, period. After that, approval was automatic. And once automatic approval was granted, fines for non-compliance were not just invalid. They were illegal. I handed them a printed statement from a legal consultant specializing in HOA law, confirming that my interpretation was correct. I didn't threaten a lawsuit. I didn't need to. The implications were enough. They knew what this meant, not just for me, but for the structure they had relied on to keep everyone in line. If one clause could nullify thousands in fines, then what else in their system could be challenged? What other rules had they bent, ignored, or manipulated to maintain control? They sat there, staring at the binder like it was a bomb. The president of the board, who had avoided eye contact until now, finally looked at me. His face was unreadable, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't going to be a fight they could win with procedure. Not this time. The rules were no longer theirs to weaponize. They had been caught using a broken map to lead an entire community, and now someone had finally pointed it out. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just stood there while they whispered among themselves, flipping through pages they had probably never read as carefully as I had. I was done being quiet, done being polite while they punished people for imagined crimes. I had brought the truth into their carefully constructed kingdom of silence, and they weren't ready for it. It didn't happen all at once. They didn't throw their hands up or issue a formal apology right there in the meeting. That's not how people like that operate. But something shifted. You could feel it in the room, like the air had thickened, like a curtain had been pulled back, and everyone was seeing the machinery behind the performance for the first time. The board members stopped speaking in confident tones. They stopped quoting their rules as gospel. Instead, they shuffled papers, avoided eye contact, and leaned into whispers. The spell they had cast over this neighborhood for so long had finally been broken. After the meeting, I walked out into the night air and stood quietly by my car. A few neighbors nodded to me. Some didn't say anything, but I could tell by their glances they'd been listening. They had heard every word. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel like the outcast. I felt like someone who had cracked the surface of something bigger, something deeper than just a series of fines and violations. I had challenged the illusion, and it had flinched. The next week. The letters stopped. The fines stopped. The daily harassment vanished without explanation. It was as if someone hit a switch and decided to pretend nothing had happened. No calls, no emails, no follow-up notices. The silence that once punished me now served as their retreat. But I didn't forget, and I didn't let it go, because I knew what they had done. And I knew they owed me more than just their silence. I compiled everything and filed an official grievance through the state's Homeowner Protection Agency. I attached every piece of evidence, every photo, every rule they violated. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. I wanted a record that showed they couldn't just erase what they had done because they'd been caught. And then I hired legal counsel, not to escalate, but to protect myself. Because when you stand up to power, even politely, even with proof, they don't always back down. Sometimes they double down. I wasn't going to let them get that chance. Weeks later, I received a letter. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from their own legal team, carefully worded, overly formal, and full of terms like reassessment and settlement. They didn't admit fault, of course, but they didn't have to, because included in the letter was confirmation that all my fines had been reversed. Every dollar, every cent. And a check was enclosed, not just refunding what I had paid, but covering damages. Emotional distress, legal expenses, even the cost of the modifications they had claimed were violations. They didn't say, "We're sorry." They didn't have to. The check said it for them. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Not because of the money, but because of what it represented. A complete reversal. A system that had once pressed its boot down on my neck, now being forced to clean the tread marks. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was structural. It proved that even the most rigid systems can be bent back into shape when someone dares to question them. It proved that fear only works until someone decides to stop being afraid after that. Things changed in the neighborhood. People started speaking more openly. I got calls from neighbors I hadn't spoken to before, asking how I had done it, what I had found, if I could help them navigate their own issues with the board. I shared what I could, not because I wanted attention, but because no one should have to fight that fight alone. The HOA still held their meetings, still sent out newsletters, still walked around with clipboards and measuring tape. But something in their step had changed. Slower, more careful, less certain. They knew now that someone was watching them the way they had watched us. I began attending the meetings regularly, not as a victim, but as a homeowner with a voice. I brought the same binder. I asked questions. I read every line of every new rule they proposed. I wasn't disruptive. I was thorough, and it made them nervous, because they weren't used to being held to the standards they so eagerly imposed on everyone else. They weren't used to having their authority checked, their wording challenged, their timelines questioned. But now they had to get used to it. The board changed over time. Some members resigned quietly. Others stepped down at election time, not even bothering to campaign. New faces joined, and with them came new priorities. Transparency, fairness, communication. The same board that had once tried to break me was slowly being replaced by people who wanted to fix what had been broken. Not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered in silence.